Introduction. Frederick Soriu's series of 4 prints visualized his dream of a world made up of democratic and social republics, with the first print depicting the peoples of Europe and America marching in a long train and offering homage to the Statue of Liberty as they pass by it. In Soriu's utopian vision, the peoples of the world are grouped as distinct nations, identified through their flags and national costume, with the United States and Switzerland leading the procession. Nationalism emerged as a force in the 19th century, bringing about sweeping changes in the political and mental world of Europe. The end result of these changes was the emergence of the nation-state in place of the multinational dynastic empires of Europe. A nation-state was one in which the majority of its citizens, and not only its rulers, came to develop a sense of common identity and shared history or descent. This commonness was forged through struggles, through the actions of leaders and the common people, and did not exist from time immemorial. The concept and practices of a modern state, in which a centralized power exercised sovereign control over a clearly defined territory, had been developing over a long period of time in Europe. Soriu's print depicts the shattered remains of the symbols of absolutist institutions on the earth in the foreground of the image. The print also includes Christ, saints, and angels gazing upon the scene from the heavens above, symbolizing fraternity among the nations of the world. The German peoples did not yet exist as a united nation when Soriu created the image, but the black, red, and gold flag they carry is an expression of liberal hopes in 1848 to unify the numerous German-speaking principalities into a nation-state under a democratic constitution. 1. The French Revolution and the idea of the nation. The French Revolution of 1789 marked the emergence of nationalism as a political force, as the transfer of sovereignty from the monarchy to the people led to the formation of a unified French nation. The revolutionaries introduced various measures and practices to create a sense of collective identity among the French people, such as the ideas of la patrie, the fatherland, and le citoyen, the citizen, and new flag, hymns, oaths, and martyrs. A centralized administrative system was established, with uniform laws, customs, and weights and measures, and the French language was promoted as the common language of the nation. The revolutionaries saw it as the mission and destiny of the French nation to liberate other peoples of Europe from despotism, which led to the spread of nationalism beyond France. Napoleon continued many of the reforms introduced during the Revolution, such as the Napoleonic Code that abolished privileges based on birth and established equality before the law and secured the right to property. Napoleon also introduced administrative reforms in regions under French control, such as simplifying administrative divisions, abolishing the feudal system, freeing peasants from serfdom and manorial dues, and removing guild restrictions in towns. The reactions of local populations to French rule were mixed, as initial enthusiasm for the French armies as harbingers of liberty turned to hostility when increased taxation, censorship, forced conscription into the French armies, and other drawbacks outweighed the advantages of the administrative changes. 2. The making of nationalism in Europe. Mid-18th century Europe was divided into kingdoms, duchies, and cantons, and did not have the nation-states as we know them today. The rulers of these territories had autonomous control over their regions, and there was no centralized authority. Eastern and Central Europe were under autocratic monarchies, where diverse peoples lived within the territories, and often spoke different languages and belonged to different ethnic groups. The Habsburg Empire ruled Austria-Hungary, which was a patchwork of many different regions and peoples, including the Alpine regions, Bohemia, and Italian-speaking provinces. Hungary had a diverse population where half of the people spoke Magyar, and the other half spoke various dialects. In Galicia, the aristocracy spoke Polish, and there were also many subject peasant peoples, including Bohemians, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croats, and Romans. These diverse groups did not easily promote a sense of political unity, and the only tie binding them together was a common allegiance to the emperor. How did nationalism and the idea of the nation-state emerge? 2.1 The aristocracy and the new middle class. A landed aristocracy was the dominant social and political class on the continent, united by a common way of life that cut across regional divisions. They owned estates in the countryside and townhouses and spoke French for purposes of diplomacy and in high society. The majority of the population was made up of the peasantry, who farmed the land either as tenants or small owners in Western Europe, but on vast estates worked by serfs in Eastern and Central Europe. The growth of industrial production and trade in Western and parts of Central Europe led to the emergence of commercial classes based on production for the market. Industrialization began in England in the second half of the 18th century, but in France and parts of the German states, it occurred only during the 19th century. The growth of industrial production and trade gave rise to new social groups, including a working-class population and middle classes made up of industrialists, businessmen, and professionals. Ideas of national unity gained popularity among the educated, liberal middle classes, following the abolition of aristocratic privileges. These groups were smaller in number in Central and Eastern Europe until the late 19th century. 2.2 What did liberal nationalism stand for? Meaning, early 19th century liberal thought in Europe was intimately related to ideas of national unity. The Latin word libere, which means free, is the source of the word liberalism. Liberty in social life, for the new middle classes, liberalism represented individual freedom and fairness for all people under the law. Liberty in politics, in terms of politics, it promoted the idea of consent-based government. Since the French Revolution, liberalism has advocated for representative governance through parliament, an end to despotism and ecclesiastical privileges, and a constitution. Liberals in the 19th century likewise emphasized the inviolability of private property. But universal suffrage was not a requirement for equality before the law. You may recall that the ability to vote and run for office were only given to women in revolutionary France, the first political experiment in liberal democracy. All women and men without property were denied political rights. All adult males had the right to vote under the Jacobins, but for a brief time. The Napoleonic Code, on the other hand, reinstated limited suffrage and elevated women to the status of minors, subordinate to their husbands and fathers. Women and men without property organized opposition movements during the 19th and early 20th centuries to pursue equal political rights. Liberty in economic sphere. Liberalism promoted the openness of markets and the elimination of governmental limitations on the flow of capital and goods. The growing middle classes in the 19th century made this a major demand. Let's use the first half of the 19th century in the German-speaking countries as an example. Out of innumerable tiny kingdoms, Napoleon's administrative strategies formed a confederation of 39 states. Each of these had its own weights and measurements in addition to its own money. In order to sell his products in 1833, a merchant going from Hamburg to Nuremberg would have had to walk through 11 customs checkpoints and pay a customs charge of roughly 5% at each one. Frequently, duties were assessed based on the size or weight of the goods. This required laborious calculation because each location has its own weights and measures system. For instance, the L, a measure of cloth, had a different meaning in each region. An ounce of fabric purchased in Frankfurt would yield 54.7 centimeters of cloth, 55.1 centimeters in Mainz, 65.6 centimeters in Nuremberg, and 53.5 centimeters in Freiburg. The emerging commercial classes, who fought for the establishment of a unified economic region allowing the unrestricted movement of products, people, and capital, saw such circumstances as barriers to economic trade and growth. On Prussia's initiative, a customs union, or Zollverein, was established in 1834, and the majority of the German states joined. The union eliminated tariff barriers and decreased there from being over 30 different currencies to just 2. Railway construction boosted mobility even more and used economic motivations to advance racial unification. The broader nationalist sentiments that were developing at the time were fueled by a surge of economic nationalism. 2.3 A new conservatism after 1815. Following the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, European governments were driven by conservatism and aimed to preserve traditional institutions of state and society, such as the monarchy, the church, social hierarchies, property, and the family. Modernization was seen as a way to strengthen traditional institutions, making state power more effective and strong. A modern army, efficient bureaucracy, dynamic economy, and the abolition of feudalism and serfdom could strengthen the autocratic monarchies of Europe. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 was hosted by Austrian Chancellor Duke Metternich and aimed to undo most of the changes that had come about in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. The Bourbon dynasty was restored to power, and France lost the territories it had annexed under Napoleon. New states were set up on the boundaries of France to prevent French expansion in the future. The Kingdom of the Netherlands, which included Belgium, was set up in the north and Genoa was added to Piedmont in the south. Prussia was given important new territories on its western frontiers, while Austria was given control of northern Italy. But the German Confederation of 39 states that had been set up by Napoleon was left untouched. In the east, Russia was given part of Poland, while Prussia was given a portion of Saxony. Conservative regimes set up in 1815 were autocratic and did not tolerate criticism and dissent. They imposed censorship laws to control what was said in newspapers, books, plays, and songs that reflected the ideas of liberty and freedom associated with the French Revolution. The memory of the French Revolution continued to inspire liberals, who criticized the new conservative order and took up issues like freedom of the press. 2 point for the revolutionaries. After 1815, liberal nationalists emerged in Europe who opposed the conservative order established by the Vienna Congress and sought liberty and freedom. The liberal nationalists also saw the creation of nation-states as necessary for their struggle for freedom. Secret societies emerged in many European states to train revolutionaries and spread their ideas. Giuseppe Mazzini was an Italian revolutionary who believed in the creation of a single unified republic within a wider alliance of nations, and founded underground societies like Young Italy and Young Europe. Giuseppe Mazzini was born in Genoa in 1807. He became a member of the secret society of the Carbonari. As a young man of 24, he was sent into exile in 1831 for attempting a revolution in Liguria. Mazzini believed that God had intended nations to be the natural units of mankind. So Italy could not continue to be a patchwork of small states and kingdoms. Mazzini's vision of democratic republics in opposition to monarchy frightened the conservatives, with Metternich describing him as the most dangerous enemy of our social order. 3. The Age of Revolutions, 1830 to 1848. The conservative regimes that emerged after the Vienna Congress of 1815 were driven by a spirit of conservatism and sought to preserve traditional institutions like the monarchy, the church, and social hierarchies. Most of these regimes were autocratic and did not tolerate criticism or dissent. They imposed censorship laws to control what was said in newspapers, books, plays, and songs that reflected the ideas of liberty and freedom associated with the French Revolution. In response to this repression, liberal nationalists formed secret societies and trained revolutionaries to fight for liberty, freedom, and the creation of nation-states. Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian revolutionary, founded 2 underground societies, Young Italy and Young Europe, whose members were young men from Poland, France, Italy, and the German states. Mazzini believed that God had intended nations to be the natural units of mankind, and he saw the unification of Italy as a necessary part of the struggle for freedom. Liberal nationalists were increasingly associated with revolution in many regions of Europe, such as the Italian and German states, the provinces of the Ottoman Empire, Ireland, and Poland. The first upheaval took place in France in July 1830 when the Bourbon kings were overthrown by liberal revolutionaries who installed a constitutional monarchy with Louis Philippe at its head. The July Revolution sparked an uprising in Brussels which led to Belgium breaking away from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, mobilized nationalist feelings among the educated elite across Europe. Poets and artists lauded Greece as the cradle of European civilization and mobilized public opinion to support its struggle against a Muslim empire. Finally, the Treaty of Constantinople of 1832 recognized Greece as an independent nation. 3.1 The Romantic Imagination and National Feeling. Culture played an important role in creating the idea of the nation through art and poetry, stories and music. Romanticism, a cultural movement which focused on emotions, intuition, and mystical feelings, sought to develop a particular form of nationalist sentiment. Romantic artists and poets focused on creating a sense of a shared collective heritage, a common cultural past, as the basis of a nation. German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder claimed that true German culture was to be discovered among the common people, das Volk, and that the true spirit of the nation, Volksgeist, was popularized through folk songs, folk poetry, and folk dances. The emphasis on vernacular language and the collection of local folklore was essential to the project of nation building, especially in the case of Poland, which had been partitioned at the end of the 18th century by the great powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. National feelings were kept alive in Poland through music and language, even though Poland no longer existed as an independent territory. Language played an important role in developing nationalist sentiments in Poland, where the use of the Polish language was forced out of schools and the Russian language was imposed everywhere. After an armed rebellion against Russian rule in 1831 was crushed, many members of the clergy in Poland began to use language as a weapon of national resistance, using Polish for church gatherings and all religious instruction. The use of Polish came to be seen as a symbol of the struggle against Russian dominance. 3.2 Hunger, hardship, and popular revolt. The first half of the 19th century saw a significant increase in population in Europe, which led to a shortage of employment opportunities, especially in rural areas. The rise of food prices, or a year of bad harvest, often resulted in widespread pauperism in both towns and the countryside. Small producers in towns faced stiff competition from imports of cheap machine-made goods from England, which led to economic hardship. Peasants in regions where the aristocracy still enjoyed power struggled under the burden of feudal dues and obligations. In 1848, food shortages and widespread unemployment led to the population of Paris taking to the streets and forcing Louis Philippe to flee. A republic was proclaimed. Suffrage was granted to all adult males above 21, and the right to work was guaranteed. National workshops were set up to provide employment. In 1845, weavers in Silesia led a revolt against contractors who supplied them with raw materials and gave them orders for finished textiles, but drastically reduced their payments. The weavers' desperate need for jobs was taken advantage of by contractors to reduce the prices of the goods they ordered. The weavers demanded higher wages from their contractor, but were treated with scorn and threats. Some of them then forced their way into the contractor's house, smashed its window panes and furniture, and plundered the storehouse. The contractor fled with his family, but he returned 24 hours later with the army. In the ensuing exchange, 11 weavers were shot. 3.3 1848 The Revolution of the Liberals. The 1848 revolutions in Europe saw both the poor, unemployed, and starving peasants and workers and the educated middle classes pushing for change. In France, the events of February 1848 led to the abdication of the monarch and the proclamation of a republic based on universal male suffrage. In other parts of Europe, the liberal middle classes combined their demands for constitutionalism with national unification, advocating for a constitution, freedom of the press and freedom of association. The German regions saw the formation of political associations whose members were middle-class professionals, businessmen, and prosperous artisans, who came together in Frankfurt and voted for an all-German National Assembly. The National Assembly drafted a constitution for a German nation to be headed by a monarchy subject to a parliament, but the monarchs rejected it and opposed the elected assembly. The parliament was dominated by the middle classes who resisted the demands of workers and artisans and consequently lost their support, leading to the assembly's forced disbandment. Women were actively involved in the liberal movement, forming their own political associations, founding newspapers, and participating in political meetings and demonstrations, but they were denied suffrage rights during the election of the Assembly. The cycles of revolution and repression could only be ended by granting concessions to the liberal nationalist revolutionaries, leading to the abolition of serfdom and bonded labor and the granting of more autonomy to Hungary by the Habsburg rulers. For the making of Germany and Italy. 4.1 Germany. After 1848, nationalism in Europe became associated with conservatives promoting state power, and achieving political domination. The process of German and Italian unification was led by conservative forces, with Prussia taking on the leadership of the movement for national unification. Otto von Bismarck, the chief minister of Prussia, was the architect of the process of German unification, which was carried out with the help of the Prussian army and bureaucracy. 3 wars over 7 years with Austria, Denmark, and France ended in Prussian victory and completed the process of German unification. In January 1871, the Prussian king, William I, was proclaimed German emperor in a ceremony held at Versailles, marking the completion of the process of German unification. The new German Empire placed a strong emphasis on modernizing the currency, banking, legal, and judicial systems in Germany, with Prussian measures and practices often becoming a model for the rest of the country. 4.2 Italy. Italy had a long history of political fragmentation, with Italians scattered over several dynastic states and the multinational Habsburg Empire. During the 1830s, Giuseppe Mazzina formed a secret society called Young Italy to disseminate his goals for a unitary Italian republic, but his revolutionary uprisings in 1831 and 1848 failed. The mantle of unifying Italy through war fell on Sardinia-Piedmont under its ruler King Victor Emmanuel II, with Chief Minister Cavour leading the movement to unify the regions of Italy. Cavour was not a revolutionary or a democrat, but sought to unify Italy for economic development and political dominance. Through a tactful diplomatic alliance with France, Sardinia-Piedmont succeeded in defeating the Austrian forces in 1859, with armed volunteers under the leadership of Giuseppe Garibaldi also joining the fray. In 1860, Garibaldi and his volunteers marched into South Italy and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, winning the support of local peasants to drive out the Spanish rulers. Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed King of United Italy in 1861, but much of the Italian population remained unaware of liberal nationalist ideology, and rates of illiteracy were high among the peasant masses who supported Garibaldi in southern Italy. 4.3 The Strange Case of Britain. The formation of the nation-state in Great Britain was a gradual process, rather than the result of a sudden upheaval or revolution. The primary identities of the people who inhabited the British Isles were ethnic ones, such as English, Welsh, Scot, or Irish, and each had their own cultural and political traditions. The English nation grew in wealth, importance, and power and was able to extend its influence over the other nations of the islands. The English Parliament, which had seized power from the monarchy in 1688, was the instrument through which a nation-state, with England at its center, was forged. The Act of Union, 1707, between England and Scotland resulted in the formation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and meant that England was able to impose its influence on Scotland, with the British Parliament dominated by its English members. The growth of a British identity meant that Scotland's distinctive culture and political institutions were systematically suppressed, and Catholic clans in the Scottish Highlands suffered repression whenever they attempted to assert their independence. The Irish, a country deeply divided between Catholics and Protestants, were similarly suppressed by the English, who helped the Protestants establish their dominance over a largely Catholic country. Catholic revolts against British dominance were suppressed, and after a failed revolt in 1798, Ireland was forcibly incorporated into the United Kingdom in 1801. A new British nation was forged through the propagation of a dominant English culture, with the symbols of the New Britain, the British flag, national anthem, and the English language actively promoted. 5. Visualizing the nation. Giving a face to a nation is a challenging task for artists. Personifying a nation involves representing it as a female figure, creating an allegory. The female allegory became a popular way to portray the abstract idea of the nation as a concrete form. In the French Revolution, female allegories were used to represent liberty, justice, and the Republic. In the 19th century, artists invented female allegories to represent the nation. Marianne, the allegory of the French nation, was portrayed as a popular Christian name and had attributes of liberty and the Republic. Marianne images were erected in public squares and marked on coins and stamps to remind the public of the national symbol of unity and to persuade them to identify with it. Similarly, Germania became the allegory of the German nation, and her attributes included a crown of oak leaves to represent heroism. 6. Nationalism and imperialism. Nationalism in the late 19th century became a narrow creed with limited ends, with nationalist groups becoming increasingly intolerant of each other and ready to go to war. The major European powers manipulated nationalist aspirations of subject peoples to further their own imperialist aims. The Balkans region was a source of nationalist tension in Europe after 1871, comprising various ethnic and geographical variations of Slavs. The Ottoman Empire's attempts at modernization and internal reforms failed, leading to its European subject nationalities breaking away and declaring independence. Balkan peoples based their claims for independence or political rights on nationality and history. The Balkan states were fiercely jealous of each other and each hoped to gain more territory at the expense of others, leading to intense conflict and big power rivalry. The intense rivalry among European powers over trade, colonies, naval, and military might complicated the Balkan problem and led to a series of wars in the region, ultimately resulting in the First World War. Everywhere were nationalist and inspired by a sense of collective national unity forged in confrontation with imperialism. Nationalism were nowhere replicated as people everywhere developed their own specific variety of nationalism. The idea of organizing societies into nation-states came to be accepted as natural and universal.